The autumn air was damp and heavy with the smell of wet soil. In the far fields just outside the village, a farmer pressed his spade deep into the ground, preparing the earth for the coming winter. The morning mist clung low, curling around the furrows, muffling even the crows overhead. He had done this work 100 times before turning soil, clearing stones, but this morning, something stopped him cold. The metal edge of his spade struck not rock, not root, but something softer, fragile. He knelt, brushing the soil away with his hands, and what emerged chilled him to the marrow. Tiny bones, brittle and pale against the black earth. At first he did not understand. They seemed too small, too delicate to belong to any animal he knew. And then the shape became clear. A rib cage, no larger than his palm. It was the body of a child. News traveled swiftly in the village, faster than the mist could lift. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the field, whispering with hands pressed to their mouths. The constable was summoned, though he himself could not bear to look too long at what lay half buried in the dirt. The farmer's plow uncovered another shallow depression, another small skeleton. Within hours the horror was undeniable. This was not the lonely grave of a single lost child. It was a burial ground. The constables widened the search, their boots sinking into the sodden earth as spades clinked against coffinless graves. With each discovery, a grim pattern emerged. The remains of infants swaddled in shreds of cloth hidden just beneath the soil. The field became a place of mourning, though no hymns were sung, no families came forward. These were children without names, without baptisms, without futures, and they had not been meant to be found. Soon, whispers turned to accusations. Who could bury so many babies in silence? Who among them carried such a terrible secret? The villagers' eyes turned not to strangers, but to one of their own. A woman who had delivered half the children in the parish, who had stood beside countless mothers in their hour of greatest need. Her name was Hester Kelling. For years, she had been a trusted midwife. The women of the village, especially the poor, turned to her when no doctor would come. She had walked in their cottages on stormy nights, her hands steady while others trembled. She had bathed newborns in basins of warm water, tied off umbilical cords with lengths of clean thread, and whispered comfort to exhausted mothers. She had seemed to many a savior. But now, in the wake of the farmer's discovery, her reputation was recast in a darker light. For each child she helped into the world, how many more had she carried away in silence? In the evening, the authorities came to her door. The village streets lay silent, windows shuttered though the lamps burned behind them. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves. The knock on her door echoed like a bell through the narrow lane. Inside, Hester was said to have stood calm, her apron still tied, her hair bound in the plain, neat bun she always wore. She neither confessed nor resisted, yet her presence alone seemed to answer the terrible question hanging in the air. Who buried the babies? As she was led away beneath the gaze of her neighbors, the village itself seemed to recoil. Was Hester Kelling a monster who preyed on the weakest lives? Or had she acted at the behest of desperate mothers, carrying out deeds that society demanded but dared not witness? The truth, like the bodies found beneath the soil, had been hidden for years. Now, unearthed, it threatened to unravel not only the life of one woman, but the fragile fabric of the entire community. And so begins the story of Hester Kelling, the midwife who buried babies. To understand the story of Hester Kelling, we must first step into her world. It was the late 19th century, a time when Europe's great cities were swelling with industry and progress, while its villages remained bound to the rhythms of land, tradition, and silence. Our story lies in one such village, a place of cobbled lanes, steep-gabled houses, and fields that stretch outward like a patchwork quilt of earth and toil. Here, life was harsh but predictable. The seasons governed everything. Spring meant planting, summer meant labor, autumn meant the harvest, and winter brought hunger, cold, and death. Families were large, not out of abundance but necessity. For children were both a blessing and a burden, hands to work the land, yet mouths to feed when the cupboards were bare. It was also a time steeped in moral codes. The church bells dictated, more than the hours. They commanded conscience and behavior. Respectability was a currency as precious as gold. To fall outside of it, through poverty, scandal, or illegitimacy, was to risk ruin. Nowhere was this more true than for young women who found themselves with child, yet without a husband. In such cases, shame was not an abstract idea. It was a force as real as hunger. An unmarried mother could lose her place in her family, her position in service, even her right to remain in the village. Many faced a future of isolation, poverty, and judgment that never faded. Some mothers abandoned their newborns at church steps, hoping charity might save them. Others sought quiet solutions, the kind not spoken of in daylight. This is where the figure of the midwife emerges, both savior and gatekeeper. Midwives were indispensable. Doctors rarely ventured into the countryside unless called by wealthy families, and even then, their knowledge of childbirth was limited compared to women who had spent their lives attending births. A good midwife could mean the difference between survival and death for both mother and child. She brought not only skill, but comfort and discretion. Hester Kelling was such a figure. Born the daughter of a midwife herself, she was apprenticed young, learning how to soothe pain with steady words and herbal tinctures, how to recognize when labor had turned deadly, how to act swiftly with her hands when there was no time to wait for a surgeon. By the time she reached adulthood, she had attended more births than most men in the parish would see in their lifetimes. Her reputation grew. She was known as practical, serious, and dependable. The villagers respected her. Though respect was not the same as warmth, Hester did not laugh easily, nor did she invite friendship. She lived alone after her husband's death, or, some whispered, his abandonment. In either case, her cottage was small, neat, and filled with the tools of her trade: linen cloths folded, with care, jars of dried herbs, and the ever-present birthing chair. But alongside trust came something more dangerous: secrecy. Women in trouble turned to her not only for safe delivery, but for something far more delicate. If a baby was born still, or if a mother could not raise her child, Hester was there. She knew what to say, what to do, how to ensure that whispers never reached the wider community. In those days, infant mortality was tragically common. It was not unusual for half of all children to die before their 5th birthday, many in their very first weeks of life. Small coffins were carried through village churchyards so often that they hardly drew notice. Against such a backdrop, it was easy for one midwife to claim a death was natural, that a child had not drawn its first breath, or that weakness had claimed it within hours. No one questioned. Few dared. And yet, behind this veil of silence, patterns began to form. A mother's relief too quick, a burial too quiet, a number of deaths too high to dismiss. Hester's role, once viewed as guardian of life, carried a shadow. She stood at the crossroads of necessity and morality, in a world that left little room for mercy. The stage was set. A village bound by tradition, a society ruled by shame, and a midwife who moved between both worlds, holding secrets no one wished to name aloud. The question that remained was whether Hester Kelling was merely a woman caught in the cruel machinery of her time, or whether she had embraced the darkness it offered. The story of Hester Kelling's crimes does not begin with a scream or a violent act. It begins with silence. A silence that stretched across years, broken only by whispers in the lanes and the muffled sobs of women who could not speak openly of what they had lost. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Childbirth was perilous in those days, and the graveyards of small villages filled with infants who never saw a summer. Death was expected. It was, in a grim way, ordinary. But the villagers began to notice that deaths followed Hester more closely than chance alone would allow. One woman recalled how she had labored in the dim light of her cottage, her family gathered outside, waiting to hear a baby's cry. Hester had worked quickly, her hands steady, her voice calm, and then, nothing. The midwife emerged hours later, her face expressionless, announcing that the child had been born still. The mother, too weak to argue, accepted the words. The body was taken away. No one else saw it again. Others told similar stories. A birth behind closed doors, a midwife's solemn declaration, and the hurried digging of a small grave. For years, these tales lived only in hushed corners, too dangerous to voice aloud. To accuse a midwife was to risk alienation, for who else would come when the next labor arrived? Yet suspicion was there, gnawing like roots beneath the soil. The pattern grew clearer when young women, the kind whose pregnancies carried scandal, were seen slipping into Hester's cottage after dark. They came cloaked, sometimes escorted by a worried aunt or a neighbor sworn to secrecy. But when they emerged, they carried no child. To outsiders, it was explained away as a stillbirth, a misfortune that drew only nods of weary understanding. But among those who watched more closely, the truth seemed less innocent. Some claimed Hester offered these women a choice, though perhaps choice was too gentle a word. She could deliver the baby, or she could make the problem go away. Whether she killed the children outright or allowed them to perish through neglect, no one knew. What was certain was that her small garden bore more turned earth than most, and that she alone controlled what passed into it. Years later, when the graves were uncovered, the scale of her actions became undeniable. The remains were not scattered at random, but carefully, deliberately placed. Some were wrapped in fragments of cloth, a remnant of care, or perhaps an attempt to hide them from decay. Others were laid with nothing at all, their bones pressed directly into the earth. How many children were buried beneath Hester's watch? Estimates varied wildly. Some said a handful, others whispered of dozens. What was known for certain was that it had gone on far too long and far too quietly. The victims were not just the infants. They were also the women who had sought Hester's mothers, who lived the rest of their lives in the shadow of what had transpired. Some may have begged her to take their babies, unable to face the crushing stigma of raising a child alone. Others may have been deceived, told their infants were stillborn when they had in fact lived. For these women, guilt and uncertainty lingered like ghosts, tormenting them long after the graves were filled. As for Hester herself, her motives remained cloaked in mystery. Was she driven by cruelty, by profit, by some twisted sense of mercy? Or was she, as some argued, merely carrying out the unspoken demands of a society that punished illegitimacy with ruthless judgment? The truth likely lay somewhere in between. She was a woman of skill, yes, but also a woman under strain, widowed, financially strained, perhaps hardened by the endless suffering she witnessed. Each decision, whether to save or to smother, carried her further down a path from which she could not return. Still, suspicions alone could not bring her down. For years, no one dared confront her directly. It would take a single voice, trembling yet determined, to pierce the silence. A young mother who had lost more than she could bear would finally speak, and in her testimony the fragile wall of secrecy would begin to crumble. The crimes of Hester Kelling had been committed in darkness, under the weight of shame and secrecy. But now, at last, they were beginning to come to light. The discovery of the tiny graves unsettled the village in ways no one could easily articulate. People walked the streets with their eyes lowered, as though the earth itself might betray their secrets. Mothers clutched their children tighter, while fathers lingered longer in the taverns, muttering half-formed accusations into their ale. Yet for all the unease, one question towered above the rest. How could this have gone on unnoticed for so long? The answer, the constables realized, lay not in the earth but in the mouths of the villagers. And so they began their investigation not with science, primitive as it was in those days, but with questions. At first, there was resistance. Infant deaths were so common that no one wished to risk their own reputation by accusing a respected midwife. Hester Kelling had walked into their homes during their most vulnerable moments. To betray her was to betray the unspoken pact of secrecy that governed childbirth, poverty, and shame. But slowly, voices emerged. A young woman, pale and trembling, spoke first. Her child, she confessed, had been born breathing, weakly, but alive. Hester had taken the baby into her arms, murmured something she could not recall, and then silence. Hours later, the midwife returned, saying the infant had slipped away. No one else had witnessed it. The mother, too weak to rise from her bed, had accepted the words, But now, confronted with the truth unearthed in the fields, she could no longer hold her tongue. Her testimony opened the floodgates. Other women came forward, their stories different yet eerily alike. Some admitted they had begged Hester for help when they found themselves pregnant out of wedlock. They had no illusions about what kind of help they were asking for. Hester had not refused them. Others claimed they had never sought such a thing, but their babies had been taken nonetheless, with Hester insisting the child had not survived. The constables pieced together a chilling pattern. There were too many coincidences, too many stillbirths. Without witnesses, too many hurried burials. Hester's quiet garden became the center of attention. Men with spades tore up the earth while neighbors stood at the hedges, watching with pale faces. The smell of damp soil and decay hung heavy as each small bundle was lifted from the ground. The bodies revealed little. Forensic science in the 1880s was crude. Determining cause of death in decomposed infants was nearly impossible. There were no tests for smothering, no reliable methods to distinguish stillbirth from murder once the body had begun to decay. What remained was circumstantial evidence, yet the sheer number of graves spoke volumes. Confronted with the evidence, Hester Kelling did not confess. She stood silent before the magistrate, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. Some said she looked defiant, others claimed she seemed broken, but none could read her thoughts. When asked directly if she had killed the infants, she offered only a quiet statement. "I buried what was given to me." The meaning of those words split the village in two. To some it was a denial, proof that she had merely tended to stillborns and carried out the sad duty of burial when grieving mothers could not. To others, it was a veiled admission, an acknowledgement that she had accepted living children and consigned them to the ground. The public reaction was swift and violent. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse when she was brought for questioning, shouting curses and prayers in equal measure. Newspapers from the nearby city seized on the scandal, printing lurid headlines about the midwife of death. At the same time, some women defended her in hushed tones, insisting that without Hester, many of them would have faced lives ruined by disgrace. The authorities, though, had little choice. With multiple graves, consistent testimonies, and a storm of public outrage, Hester Kelling was arrested and charged. She was led through the streets in irons, her plain bonnet shading her face as villagers leaned from windows, some spitting, some weeping. For the first time in her life, Hester no longer walked as a midwife welcomed into homes. She walked as a prisoner, a figure of fear, her fate to be decided not by the cries of newborns, but by the cold judgment of the law. The trial loomed. The community that had once relied on her now gathered to witness her judgment. And in that courtroom, filled with men who had never known the peril of childbirth or the crushing shame of illegitimacy, the question of her guilt would finally be put to the test. The trial of Hester Kelling began on a gray winter morning. The courthouse, a squat stone building at the edge of the provincial town, filled quickly with villagers who had traveled by cart and foot to witness the proceedings. The air inside was thick with a mixture of damp wool, coal smoke from the iron stove, and the low murmur of speculation. It was not only a trial of one woman, it was a reckoning for an entire community. Hester was led into the chamber wearing a plain dress, her bonnet removed, her hair pulled tightly back. She looked older than her years, her face drawn and pale, but she held herself upright. No tears, no visible tremors. If she felt fear, she hid it with the same composure that had carried her through countless nights of childbirth. The charges against her were grim: multiple counts of infanticide, unlawful concealment of birth, and improper burial. Yet the evidence, as the prosecutors well knew, was fragile. The bodies uncovered were too decayed for certainty, the science too crude to prove whether the infants had been stillborn or slain. What remained were testimonies, and they came in abundance. One by one, women stepped forward. Some veiled their faces, others held their heads high. Their stories echoed with uncanny similarity. A child born alive, however weak, placed in Hester's arms, only to vanish. A whispered bargain in the shadows of her cottage. A hurried burial with no prayer, no witness, no family to mourn. There were contradictions, too. A few insisted that Hester had merely carried out their wishes, that she had offered a grim mercy when they had nowhere else to turn. Others painted her as a deceiver, taking infants under the guise of care, only to end their lives without consent. The line between desperation and murder blurred until even the magistrates struggled to parse it. The defense argued that she was a scapegoat, condemned for circumstances created by the very society that now judged her. Was she to be blamed for high infant mortality, a tragedy that stalked every household? Was she to be punished for the silence of women who had sought her help but now turned against her to save themselves? Still, the weight of unearthed graves hung heavy. When the farmer who had first struck his spade against the bones testified, the courtroom fell silent. His voice broke as he described the sight of the tiny rib cage, pale against the soil. Whatever sympathy Hester might have inspired, it crumbled beneath the image of that fragile body. The verdict, when it came, was delivered in somber tones. Guilty, not of every death, for proof was elusive, but of enough. The court declared her responsible for at least several unlawful burials, and by implication, the lives that had been cut short. The sentence was severe: imprisonment for life, a mercy in itself, for many had clamored for the gallows. The reaction outside was swift and divided. Some cheered, shouting that justice had been done, that the village was at last free of the shadow she had cast. Others wept, not for her innocence, but for the tangled tragedy of it all, for the mothers who had turned to her in desperation, for the children whose names were never spoken, and for the woman herself, once a guardian of life, now condemned as its taker. In prison, Hester faded into obscurity. Records noted her declining health, the illnesses that spread easily in damp, crowded cells. She worked in the laundry, spoke little, and died within a few years, buried in an unmarked grave. The woman who had overseen so many births and burials was herself laid to rest without ceremony. Yet the memory of her deeds did not vanish. For decades her name lingered in the village, spoken with unease. Some called her a monster. Others muttered that she was no more than a reflection of the cruelties of her time, a society that condemned mothers for bearing children outside marriage, then turned a blind eye when those children disappeared. Newspapers of the era seized on her story, framing it as both cautionary tale and scandal. In broader society, it fed debates about the role of midwives, the need for stricter oversight, and the dangers of leaving the poor without safe or compassionate options. In some circles, it even stirred sympathy for unmarried mothers, though true reform was still decades away. Today, the graves of the infants remain the truest testimony. They are unmarked, their identities lost, yet their presence beneath the soil speaks more clearly than any courtroom ever could. They remind us not only of Hester Kelling's deeds, but of the world that allowed them to happen, a world where silence, shame, and secrecy cost more lives than any single pair of hands. In the end, the story of Hester Kelling is not easily resolved. Was she a calculating murderer, profiting from despair? Or was she a desperate woman, burdened with the darkest requests of others, enacting the cruelties society demanded but dared not see? The truth lies buried somewhere between the two, like the children she laid in the earth, hidden yet never fully forgotten.